Well, happy April 1st, everybody. This is not April Fool's. We have a great person on here with us today. Alan Nolan is our school board director at Mead School District here just north of Spokane, and he's joining us today. Alan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, MJ. It's great to be here. I tell you what, there is an April Fool's joke from the city of Spokane. It's probably the worst April Fool's joke where they just increased our sales tax yet again. So,
yes. That's anyway. We're gonna get into bad policies here in a second, but I want to start off with some good stuff, which is Alan. You're school board director currently. You've been a school board director since you were elected in 2023, correct?
Correct.
In the fall, and so a little over a year. So tell everybody your story. What did you do prior, and what led you to get involved at this level?
Well, I'll start off with what brought me to the Mead School Board. And the story that I tell everybody is that they made my wife mad and I wasn't going to have that. Short story on that. They were modifying the district boundaries for some of the schools, and my wife was really upset about it. Now, my background, I grew up in Michigan and I was retired Air Force, spent 20 plus years doing flying a number of different aircraft in the Air Force. And so with all that time in the Air Force, there are a lot of Air Force families and military families that pick up and move on a regular basis. And their kids seem to do fine. They're pretty resilient about it. So the fact that our kids were maybe going to have to go from Midway, which is our local elementary, to Northwood rather than Mountainside, really bothered my wife, but I wasn't as concerned about it. So there was a big get together at Midway Elementary where they were going to just talk about the plans and take inputs. And ultimately, they listened and told us how this was basically how it was going to be. There were a couple of board members there and not really very receptive. And our representative, Denny Denholm at the time, he didn't even show up. And so at that point, I got a little bit upset. And at that point, I wasn't ready to run, but about 3 or 4 years later, when the next election cycle came up and I continued to see what was going on with the Mead School District, I decided that the person who also didn't show up for meetings also was not taking care of the business that needed to be done to protect our kids. And that's what led me to run. Now, as far as going back to my background, I do have 3 children there in the school district. My wife and I, we moved here back in 2015 when I retired from the Air Force. And like I said, I spent 20 plus years. I flew a number of different aircraft. And so I had a different job every about 8 to 10 months. So jumping on the school board is really a lot like being in the military because I didn't know anything. Well, I didn't know a lot when I jumped in, but it was something that I've, over the course of my career, have always learned how to quickly adapt and gain expertise in areas that I just didn't know about. So that was one of the reasons why I was willing to do this, even though I didn't have experience as an educator. Although I have taught, being in the military, we're oftentimes teaching people. In fact, one of my last assignments was at a pilot training squadron where I was teaching new pilots how to become pilots. And between the organizational side of that, as well as the educational side, I get a lot of what's involved in teaching. It's a different crowd and a different topic, certainly, but a lot of the concepts are similar. And the mission that's associated with in terms of making sure that we provide an effective educational environment for our kids, that ties in really closely with what I did in the Air Force. And one of the things that I really loved about it.
Yeah. That's awesome. And we've got one of your supporters here joining us. Thanks, Brooke. Alan is an incredible board member. I couldn't be more proud of his representation of Mead families. That's awesome. So yeah, we appreciate it. And welcome everybody, by the way. If you want to comment and engage, hopefully we'll be able to see your comments. Last interview I wasn't able to, but obviously it's working today. And so if you've got questions for Alan as we go through this, we're gonna be talking about some current happenings and stuff with Mead. Definitely say hi, post your comment, post your questions, and hopefully we can get to them. So Alan, what strikes me with your history and your background is that here you had a very important job, and obviously probably a mentor and training, and like you said, educating people to be competent in their ability right, in their line of work. So not only did you have to succeed at your line of work, you also were helping others too as well. So you know what it looks like. You know what education looks like you said. This isn't rocket science, and completely. So really appreciate you stepping up. Did you have any other political background or history that led you to get involved, or was this just kind of like, okay, it's time, we need to step up the game here?
No, no prior political experience. I had served on, in fact, I was on the plans commission for the county, but that's an appointed thing. And I'd also served in some other governmental organizations. I served on the technical advisory group for the energy code that revised the residential energy code a couple of years back. I've got a business where I now am a contractor and I'm doing a lot of residential work. So I built some expertise there as well and got involved in that. But outside of that, I never run for office. And in fact, I hadn't really intended to run for office. What happened was one of the other school board members, Brianne Gray, when she ran back in, I guess that was 2019, I supported her because I thought she was a great candidate, and I was not particularly pleased with the person she was running against, and I thought that a change was appropriate. Well, once Brianne got on, she and I had talked about other people because I wanted to see us have a conservative board that had the strength to stand up to the state, because I can see what's going on here as well as in other places. And she and I talked about some of the folks who were looking to potentially run within my district. And ultimately, I was happy to support those people and had even spoken to them. Then Brianne, I want to say it was Monday of filing week, called me up and said that the person who we thought was going to run had backed out and that there wasn't anybody else. And then he was going to run unopposed again. He had never been opposed in 25 years. So I said, all right, let me talk with the family and think about it. But we spoke about it at dinner, and that was the decision. So, well, no, we're not just going to let this happen. I'm at least I'll throw my hat in. And I already had a pretty good idea of what I thought a school board director should be doing and, what the message should be. So fortunately, that part there was pretty well defined for me. It was just a matter of kind of figuring out how do I actually run the campaign.
Yeah. Yeah. And so talk about your community, and then I want to talk about your campaign just a little bit, because that was quite significant what you all did. So your community, North Spokane, is it fairly conservative, do you feel?
It is. It's probably about a 60-40 conservative majority here. And so, yeah, I mean, as far as state representation and federal representation, we tend to have Republicans, and it is a more conservative community. But, the state is fairly blue overall, and there are portions of Spokane that have become more blue, or probably the city is overall fairly purple. But it's a bit of a mixed community. So there are those who I did have a lot of good support, but then there are those who are not in agreement with the things that I'm looking to do. And for example, what we're dealing with right now, we're pushing back against state on what we view as overreach and calling out what are clearly conflicts between federal guidelines and state guidelines in some specific policies that schools are expected to follow.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to get in the details of that. I think people are going to be very interested in what is currently happening with the Trump executive orders and what's going on with our state. So talk to us about what you guys did. And that's when I met you, when you're running for office back in 2023. So you filed, and so you already had a conservative on the board. You kind of give people the picture of what the board looked like maybe before you ran, and then what it looks like now.
Right. So let's see. I think it was 2017 when that was maybe there might have been one election that I was here for prior to. I think I was here for 2016. But in any case, in 2017, I remember very clearly Michael Cannon running against, and I can't remember his candidate's name, his opponent's name, but this was an individual who had been a part of the school board and had been appointed to replace someone else. And she sounded like a very nice lady, but she sounded like more of the same and not at all what we were looking for. And so I was actually really glad that Michael stepped up and ran. And then, as I mentioned, Brianne ran a couple years later, and she ran against probably the strongest candidate who was on the board at the time. So it was I wouldn't say 2-3 majority, because Denny, he claims that he's conservative as his political philosophy, but in my view, he wasn't necessarily holding that line. And the other individuals were not not necessarily liberal or progressive, but I certainly didn't think that they were stepping up and taking a firm stand when it was appropriate. Although I will give them credit for what they did in COVID. The fact that they were the first school district back, all of them deserve credit for that. Was a brave decision and it was good for our kids. So I do want to recognize good when it does happen.
Yeah.
Ultimately, so there were two very strong conservatives, I guess we'll say it that way. They were on the board when I did file. And I ran alongside of Michael Cannon, who was up for re-election at that time, and then Jennifer Kilman too. And it was a great group. It's a great group of folks. We have a really good school board now. People who are dedicated with their what the school district needs, are willing to fight for it, and are invested in it. So I think that that's kind of gives you an idea of where we came from and to where we are. And I also want to throw out there that, hey, if there are other folks who maybe like me had never run for office, this is something to think about too. It's not a huge demand on time, and it can be a big scary thing to go out there and have your name put on the ballot and people potentially talk about you. But it's important, and especially now, there's been a long period of time where our schools have been on cruise control, and that's not the situation that we need, because where it's been cruising to has not been a good thing.
Right.
You see that test scores are down. There's been a focus on things that have nothing to do with education. And so we need people who are invested in the schools. You have kids in the district are going to bring back common sense type of principles to take a role in the school district.
Yeah. And Alan, how important do you think in these nonpartisan races, especially in like school boards and city councils in the state of Washington, where, like I said, they're nonpartisan? How important was the Republican Party and differentiating you as a conservative candidate? Did you feel how that impacted your race?
The way American politics is right now, I don't know that you really have anything that truly is nonpartisan. You might say that, but people have got views, and it's such a polarized environment that people are looking at that. A lot of times, some of the specific views that my opponent and I had, they may not necessarily have been that different. The difference in my mind was the willingness to take action on that. Unfortunately, it is such a partisan environment. You can call a race nonpartisan, but people want to know what someone believes, and because its qualifications matter, but so does that core set of values that you're bringing to the environment. That applies for the Mead School District. It applies to other schools. You look at the races that occurred in District 81, the Spokane School District. Fantastic candidate there, but because she was running on conservative principles, and that is a much more democratic leaning area, she really didn't have much of a prayer of getting elected, I believe, because people were not willing to look past the partisanship and go, what are the qualifications and what are the ideas that she's bringing would be bringing to the school board.
Yeah. And that's judicial races, school board races, city council. I do think the Republican Party, there can be a downfall if it's a real liberal area, like you said. But in Mead and other places in our county, I think it is important because the Republican Party does that research and digging into each candidate and really validating, yes, this is a conservative candidate, or yeah, we're not so sure, right? So I think that helps. So let's get into a little bit what's happening right now. And I just got to blast this up here because Brooke is you're right on, Brooke. Our children definitely depend on us. And I think one of the things that I hear you saying too, Alan, is that we need to make sure as representatives of the people that their voice is being heard, in these boards, right? It's just, we cannot go along to get along anymore. And so it takes a courageous person to stand up maybe and stand up for the truth, stand up for those voices of our parents, and maybe push back a little bit, right?
That's true. And community involvement and voice is really important. And we saw that, in fact, how we got to this current situation, which you kind of alluded to, is it's a policy known as 3211, policy and procedure. And for those who aren't terribly familiar with school board setup, there's rules where it's a policy, and that is very general. Sometimes it's almost affirmational is the way to look at it, but very broad brush concepts. And the procedure gets more into the nuts and bolts of how, whatever that topic is, how it's supposed to be dealt with, maybe describing processes or individuals who are responsible, things of that nature. Well, 3211 is something that came into play back in 2019, and it is specifically related to transgender students and transgender student policies. So in 2019, the legislature, they passed it was Senate Bill 5689, and that was passed into law. And that did a couple of things. First off, it mandated schools to have a harassment, intimidation, and bullying policy. I should go to, this is their version of it, but if you can go to, do you have the presentation, the link?
Yeah, yep, I do. Let me pull that up real quick. See how.
Yeah, I think if you go to slide number 4, that's what I was referring to.
Does that look right?
Yep, that's it. So 5689 was passed into law, and as I mentioned, it covered 2 main topics. One was it required schools to adopt a harassment, intimidation, bullying policy, which that makes sense. We don't want any of that in our schools. It also mandated the requirement to have a transgender policy. So that was labeled as 3211. And WASDA, that's the Washington State School Directors Association, they're an entity that does a lot of the policy writing on behalf of OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which is the state lead agency for education. In any case, so that was created. Mead did adopt their policy. And honestly, I didn't care for that policy very much, but it was one that was working for us. And we were able to work within the bounds of it. Let me see it that way. But around 2024 in July, WASDA actually updated it, changed the wording, and it was all based off of the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction directing changes to it on their own without going through Administrative Procedures Act, and create a policy that all students, all schools school districts were expected to adopt verbatim pretty much. And anyone that didn't, that deviated, tended to get a threatening letter from OSPI.
So let's back up just a little bit because I want to make sure people understand how this works. So like you said, there's usually a law passed by the legislature. And in that law, in the RCW, it will direct the WASDA to create a model policy for districts. So they have a policy and then a procedure based on that. So it's based on law typically, and the legislature usually directs WASDA to create these policies, not the superintendent of public instruction. So yeah, this is where it was a little different.
I think the direct linkage was I think it directed OSPI to do this, and it does that through WASDA. And when they are creating policies, one of the things I mentioned, you're supposed to be using what's known as the Administrative Procedures Act, which is essentially a process where there's a timeline and there's an opportunity for public comment. That didn't happen for either of them. And the initial law that was passed had 4 specific requirements, and they were all pretty reasonable. That had to be, all school districts had to have some sort of policy, at least reflected that. Well, we had, like I said, we adopted 3211, and then when OSPI through WASDA rewrote 3211, particularly the procedure, they added a bunch of different things and really strengthened the language based on Washington law and what I would deem their own personal beliefs, as opposed to what the law 5689 had directed. Then on top of that, in 2024, the legislature also directed a statewide civil rights review, where OSPI was to go and look at every single school district's civil rights program, and with a specific focus on the 3211, the transgender policies. So that happened for us early this year. And February 24th, that's when OSPI OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, sent us a letter. Had a number of different findings. Most of them were not significant, and we were able to clean most of them up within a week. However, the main one was 3211 and 3211P, the procedure, they were deemed non-compliant. And they gave us a 30-day window. Going back to what you were just talking about for public input, that's not realistic. The way school boards work is that usually action is only taken at a public meeting, which occurs once a month. And there's a reason for that, is that we want the public to have the opportunity to hear and comment on changes to procedures and policies that are under consideration. Well, doing that within 30 days necessarily prevented us from doing that, because we actually had our first board meeting the Monday following that letter arriving. So we hadn't had a chance to do anything. And if we were in fact be compliant, we would have just had to adopt and pass a resolution without really telling anyone. So we wrote back, and I will give OSBI credit that they said, yeah, okay, we understand. And they extended that to 60 days. So we went and, with that in mind, we started taking a look at the 3211 procedure that they wanted to adopt, and looking at the legal backing for that, both at the state and the federal level. And that's what drove us to a revision that reflects where there are changes to it from what is the WASDA model policy, which highlight both the concerns that we have, and then try and address those to thread the needle between federal guidelines and state guidelines to serve all members of our student population.
So let's talk about the details a little bit of this 3211, because we're talking like, policy geek stuff, right? We've got these numbers, but what does this mean to the average citizen? What were, like you said, there was like 4 main things that were updated, right? In the procedure from last year, and the model procedure. What were those particulars?
So there's 4 big areas that I think your typical family is going to be concerned about. And the first of those has to do with parents' rights, where there's direction in there to withhold information from parents. There's compelled speech, and if someone doesn't necessarily understand the meaning of that, is where you are forced to say something. So it's kind of the opposite of freedom of speech, where we think about the First Amendment, and that would be this. If you look for concerns on the state mandate on the presentation that we were looking at earlier.
Oh, okay.
And I can just talk to this.
Yeah.
And this isn't a bad one to have up either. On this, if you scroll down, you can see where there are, actually, this is an unhighlighted version. At the meeting, one of the things we did is we highlighted the specific procedure and showed, here's the exact language in the procedure they want us to adopt that does things like withholds information from parents, or at least advocates that we do that, or compels speech with regards to asserted pronouns. It also, there's an issue in terms of segregated spaces, both for bathrooms and locker rooms, as well as activities too. And that's one of the more outrageous ones. The specific on that was, it says, per the state, we should avoid gender segregation of school programs, and to include overnight trips. So what they're suggesting is that we shouldn't divide kids up when they're on an overnight school-sponsored trip based off of gender. That defies logic. So and then the last one is, of course, the safe and fair athletic opportunities for girls. Now, that one we didn't spend as much time on that, because the way, again, getting into some of the minutiae here, there's a very specific RCW, Revised Code of Washington law, that says school districts have the authority to oversee athletic and extracurricular programs, and then also goes on to talk about how, hey, they can delegate that authority. And that's typically done to an organization called WIAA, Washington Interscholastic Activities Association. And they write the rules and have got a handbook. And that is what says who can participate in sports. That's been a fairly hot topic issue, because the way those rules are currently written, transgender athletes are allowed to compete. So male athletes can compete in female sports. And we saw that there's the East Valley student who won the girls 400 meter event, where he was the only person even in the frame. He was that much faster than all of the rest. And that led to East Valley winning, and other girls losing out of the opportunity to stand on the podium based on their superior performance. Anyway, so those are the 4 big concerns that parents should be aware of when the state is trying to mandate a 3211 policy. And yeah, here's this slide that you're looking at here. And we did have a copy of the 3211 policy where, like I mentioned, it was specifically highlighted, and you could see exactly the wording that the state wants us to develop. But the concern with what the state's doing is that in the case of parents' rights, one, it even conflicts with the existing Parents' Bill of Rights. Now, I know
which is law right now.
It
as
is,
of
yeah.
right now.
Maybe for another 5 minutes, unfortunately. And I know that the state of Washington is in the process of trying to get that, but honestly, that is amazing to me. This was a democratically passed initiative, and I don't understand how anyone can honestly say, "Oh, this is the right thing to do," that this is what you voted for, but this is what you really meant. And that's what the state is doing. But besides that, there are issues with, and this is the case in most of these four areas that I talked about. There's problems with federal guidelines and state law. And a couple of examples are the FERPA, Federal Educational Right to Privacy Act. And that specifically says that parents, they've got a right to have access to their children's records. And the Pupils' Rights Amendments, PPRA, Protection of Pupils' Rights Amendments, it talks about how there are limitations and restrictions on what the schools can be asking students about. One of those is sexual attitudes, sexual behavior. So when they're asking students pronouns and things like that, they're violating, school districts are violating PPRA. And towards that end, we've actually put direction out because it's both off of state law, the Human Rights Commission, Washington Amended Code or Administrative Code talks about how you're not supposed to ask somebody their pronouns. It's a violation. It's considered harassment. And so it's against federal law. It's actually against state law, and it's really not the school district's business.
Wow. And this has been happening. I mean, this isn't new. This isn't
No.
new. This has been going on for a few years.
Yeah, one of the things the voted or elected representative for the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction is Chris Reckdahl, and he one of the points that he'll make is like, well, this has been around for 10 or 15 years, and he's right. It's just that it was never really a thing. It's kind of what it comes down to is somebody put it in the code, nobody got upset about it because it wasn't affecting their kid. Well, now it is affecting their kid. Girls may be getting hurt. Girls may be losing out on opportunities. There's all of these actual impacts, or they find out that there's a girl, or actually there's a male that is in the girls' bathroom, in the girls' locker room. Now this stuff is actually happening. It's like, okay, well, that I didn't agree to that, which is why parents are up in arms.
Yeah. And I think the whole thing of keeping information about your student away from parents, where it says, I mean, we had it up on screen just a second ago, where a staff is supposed to, goes against everything you just said, supposed to ask the pronouns, the preferred pronouns of a student, and then keep that from the parents. Correct? That's the current policy guidelines, correct?
Yeah, if you look at the model policy, it tells you, it actually flips the concept of parents' rights on its head. And it says you're supposed to ask the student on what they want you to do when speaking with the parents. Do you want us to tell them, the name you're using, what pronouns you're asking? That is antithetical to the very concept of parents' rights. And it's something that is fundamental to the family structure. And there's already a huge problem with trust in government institutions and in schools already. So if you have this actually happen in schools, or you create the opportunity for it, you're only exacerbating what's already a pretty significant problem. And that's the reason why we see declining enrollment across the state and really across the nation.
Yeah, for sure. How big is this for parents, Alan? How like what percentage of the contact that you get from your citizens, the people that you represent on the Mead School Board, how much of it is around these issues that we're talking about right here?
Well, on this specific one, I think I'll maybe to help kind of frame it, let's talk about the people who had show up and speak on the issue. And I think we had 350 people in the auditorium for the school board meeting. And I don't know the numbers of people who spoke, but the breakdown of those who spoke in favor of the changes we were discussing versus those who opposed was probably about 80-20, which is a pretty good match when you look at some nationwide surveys on attitudes, especially regarding transgender issues, and especially the sports and fairness aspect of it.
Right. So this was last week, correct? A week ago, Monday, right? So just a little over a week ago.
Yeah, a little
And
longer.
and you guys were focused specifically on this policy on 3211, or was there other things that drew that large crowd?
No, it was, well, we did have Farwell Elementary there, and they did a great job. And so we had a lot of parents there. Now, once the Farwell Elementary students left, then a number of those people did, but we still had about 350 people.
Wow.
So the vast majority were there specifically for the 3211. There were a few other school topics that were addressed, but none of them were even remotely controversial, and no one came to speak about any of those. We of course had some staff on hand as well, but the people who were there were primarily there based on concerns over these issues, and the concerns that I raise are the ones that I hear from them regularly.
And so, because different school boards operate differently. So how much time did you give the public to comment on this?
So I don't think we limited the number of people who spoke, but what we did do was typically it's a 3-minute time to speak. I think we limited it to 2 minutes. A lot of times as well, we don't force people to stop because there were so many people who were wanting to speak. We did have a clock running, and then once people went over the time, we tried to let them know. And then if they kept going on, we did ask them to leave or to close up.
So I have heard from some school board members that they don't allow the public to speak. And so I think that's very important. And I think what you did. So do you know how much time it was total that you listened to parents or listen to citizens?
I didn't keep track. I would say it was probably about 40 to 45 minutes. I know there were at least 20 speakers.
Wow. Wow. That's great.
Yep.
I think that's such an important part, and all politics are local. This is how you get involved, and this is how you let your representatives know how you feel as you go to these meetings. And it's like a town hall, right? Our other representatives have town halls. You guys have board meetings where you allow the public to come and speak. And now, Alan, talk to us a little bit. Are you guys advised not to comment or give feedback during the public comment time? A lot of people are, I know they have an issue with that, but there's usually a reason.
We make it a point to not turn it into a discussion because then it will draw things out. And we also, some people there, they are not happy about it, and we may not have the answers anyway. I do know that for one specific example, there had been a question that was budget related, and I happen to have that number. So afterwards, we specifically mentioned that. But typically, no, it's not an interactive thing. It's an opportunity for us to hear from the community.
Yeah. And that's intentional. So again, it's you respecting, that you're listening to the community, and then you're listening, they're providing that feedback. But it's not a two-way communication. I know a lot of people, I hear from people that are frustrated with that, but that's pretty typical of school board decorum, if you will. And also that you can't necessarily discuss something that you don't put out there on an agenda, correct?
Correct. We can modify the agenda, but especially if we were to take action, that would be an issue, and that's all governed by state law. I did actually want to take a second just to throw out kudos to both the Mead community as well as to Mike Cannon, and on as far as how the public comment section went, where, hey, we asked people, it was obviously a pretty heavy split in favor of it, and we don't want people to feel like their opinions are being quashed because maybe they're the minority. We want to hear the minority voices as well. And so even though people were not heckling certainly people that they didn't disagree with, Michael did a good job of asking people, hey, let's not be celebrating. That's not the point here. And we also don't want others to feel uncomfortable sharing their opinions. So yep. I think that was great. And it was great that all of these speakers were respectful.
That's very important. We want everybody, we believe in freedom of speech, and we want people to be able to voice their opinions. And that's part of the democratic process, right? And then decisions are made based on that. But I love that. And I think that is an important point. And Michael is the president of the board now?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. Michael Cannon. So, so this was is this probably your biggest meeting that you've had as a school board member?
I think so. I know that there had been a pretty big one about 2018 or 2019, and that was in regards to CRT and a policy related to that. That one ended up not being enacted. And I think that may have been larger than this particular one. It was certainly, I remember seeing it on the news where it seemed like it was much more contentious. This, again, it was a large crowd, but it was orderly and civil.
Okay. So now, did you guys take action that night, Alan, on this?
So, as you know, MJ, but for the audience, the way that policy and procedure adoption works is that there's a first read, second read process. Where the first read is we're just listening, we're maybe asking questions. Then there may be an opportunity between that and the next board meeting. We'll have work sessions as well that are also open to the public, but not necessarily, they're nowhere near as formalized, and they don't offer opportunities for public comment either. In any case, so it's the second read is when typically action is taken and a policy or procedure would be approved. Now, when we do actually step into the work session that's coming up in another week or so, I know that we're going to look at this specifically. And one of the things we're going to do is we know that OSPI, we're looking to work with them and try and reach a compliant policy, or what they will view as a compliant policy that will also, in our minds, satisfy some of the restrictions that exist and conflicts that exist with federal law. So there's a pretty good chance that we're going to take our policy that we proposed and send it up to them and give them an opportunity to provide some feedback.
Okay. So what, yeah, I'm kind of curious then how you might possibly, I know you can't speak on behalf of the board, but what are you thinking are some possible solutions here? So you have four, tell me if I'm gathering this right. You have four main things that are being proposed, being forced to change from the state. And it sounds like your parents are not for that, and these four areas really don't comply with state or federal law. And so what are you guys looking at possibly doing? I mean, what are the options?
Well, we did go through and do a fairly significant revision of the WASDA model policy, and that's one of the things that we then presented to the community. And the way we typically do public comment is that we let the public speak first. But because we knew so many people were going to be there to talk about this topic, instead, what we did is we went through, here's the situation, gave people the history, the concerns that we see in the conflict between federal and state guidance, and then said, okay, here, based on that, is what we think is a course that we can do that's going to protect all the students in our school and also try and protect us, because there are financial risks to the school district, both from the federal government as well as the state government, if we don't comply with either of them to the letter of the law.
Yeah, I'm
And
going
then,
to share that screen. I just saw that. Let's put that up there
sure.
because this is important for people to understand. This is not a just you got to go with what the parents say, because the impact and what the state is threatening over your head is to withhold funding, correct?
Exactly, and this has been an issue, and we saw this during COVID, where where school districts were compelled to do things they may not have wanted to do, in terms of keeping kids out of school, mask wearing, things like that. That regardless of whether or not you think they were effective, or whether regardless of the science behind it, that you had to do, or OSPI said, hey, we're going to withhold your funds. And there's the same risk here. OSPI, this is the stick that they use in order to try and drive compliance.
So
And as
you
you can see from this, 80% of our money is coming from the state.
yeah. Yeah, and that wedges you in a very between a rock and a hard place, to say the very least, because you are the closest thing to the citizens the way it should be, and that's why local control is so important. But over the years, as the state has increased funding for education, it's come more and more from the state, and this is the danger. So then
Yeah.
decisions are made more at the state level, not the local level, and then they can threaten of withholding your funding, even
And there's
though
an issue at the
parents don't
federal
agree.
level.
Say that again.
And there's an issue with that at the federal level as well. And we all have seen the news where the Trump administration has threatened to withhold funding to states. And there's some really important programs, Title I programs that are low income, for food for low income, for example, free and reduced lunches, things like that. That makes a big difference. So even if we were to lose it, it's a much smaller in terms of absolute dollars, but it's a very impactful loss of dollars.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about that now. I want to make sure, well, actually, before we jump to the federal issue, because I want to talk about that, because what you guys have done, put in motion with that is very important. Um, so how do you see this playing out, Alan? What is your, if you can have a looking glass or, a crystal ball, what do you think is going to happen with Mead School District specifically? Do you feel like you guys are going to able to kind of meet in the middle with what your parents want and what the state's demanding, and find a good common sense, common ground solution? Or what are you thinking is going to happen?
So there's three different groups there that I think we got to look at. The first of those you mentioned is the parents. And I'll go back to the public meeting. One of the things I like about that is they had a chance to hear what we were proposing, and they didn't necessarily love it, because there's portions of it I still don't like, and it's not ideal. I think that even how we have it, especially for segregated spaces, that I'm not sure it's fully compliant with federal requirements, Title IX, and the like. I did think we did a much better job in terms of the parental rights and and sharing information with parents, not withholding information anyway. And so the parents who were there, the community members who were there, they had the chance to comment specifically on what we were doing. And you could tell that they didn't necessarily, it wasn't exactly what they would have liked to have seen, but they recognized the challenges and felt that it was probably a reasonable way forward if we can get it to be acceptable. So that first group, I think that at least we've got some buy-in from the community. It may not be the exact policy they want, but I think it's an acceptable compromise.
So can you talk about the specifics, what they look like? So let's go, there was the 4 sections that you highlighted. So let's go by those one by one, and just give us an idea of what this proposed policy might look like.
Sure, absolutely. On the first one, on parental rights, we put language in there that talked about the importance of involving parents to have successful outcomes in any scenario, and that bringing families in early and often was the intent of the goal. And that was actually done in the policy. So, that broader overview. Then, as far as the specific procedures, we strengthened language talking about how FERPA, the federal rights, educational rights to privacy, how that mandated that parents have an absolute right to see information about their kids. Oh, what was the other portion?
So then you got compelled speech. Okay, so
I'll get to that. But in terms of, then there were a few other portions too, where basically there's another policy that talks about working notes, and we did not want working notes. It says working notes don't necessarily have to be released within school policy. Specifically made a change within 3211 that if there's information that is about a student gender identity or gender issues along those lines, that can't be a working note.
It can't be something that's kept from parents.
Right. I don't want that to be a tool that's used then to hide it from parents, because I want parents to be able to know.
So basically, you are proposing this would allow parents to have access to anything that has to do with this issue around their child.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we did keep some of the state's language in terms of trying to speak with the student first and at least coordinate with them, because we are trying to meet in the middle. So that covers the parents' rights issue and where we tried to thread the needle there. With compelled speech, ultimately, one of the big issues there is the use of preferred pronouns that don't match with somebody's sex. There's a lot of court history against compelled speech, especially if it's a strongly held view. And I think you can come at it from a couple of different perspectives. It could be from a religious viewpoint, where you say, hey, listen, I believe, whether it's biblical or whatever your religious text or religious philosophy is, that based on my religion, that there are only 2 genders, 2 sexes, and that's an absolute, and anything beyond that is compelling me to say something that is in opposition to a strongly held belief. I also think you could do that just based from a strictly factual and even a scientific basis, where there's, per definition, sex it's real, it's binary, and it's immutable, which is not the position that really is being advanced in the 3211. It's not specifically laid out, but it clearly suggests that you have to accept whatever is asserted. And I think that compelling someone to say that when it's contrary to truth, it goes against the very concept of education. These are provable and verifiable facts. These are definitions that have been commonly accepted. And so there's a reason why someone could consider that to be a strongly held belief. Ultimately, what we look to do there is, rather than compel someone to use pronouns, we advocated, or we stated in there, that staff should, to the maximum extent practical, be using the student's first name. And we do want to respect, if someone wants to go by a nickname, and whether it's a name that is consistent with their gender or not, I think that certainly that should be respected. So that was the compromise that we looked to achieve there in terms of compelled speech. And that goes for both students and staff. And there are restrictions on staff and their ability to have freedom of speech while they're in the workplace. But again, in the case of strongly held views, there's a lot of federal court precedent that's in favor of that. And there's specific cases, Tennessee versus Cardona, for example, specifically talked about the chilling effect of requiring compelled use of pronouns.
Well, and it, like you brought up, I mean, that's religious discrimination, right? I mean, we have laws protecting religious, discrimination as well. I mean, they talk about discrimination, and that's where a lot of these policies are coming from. But then they leave out like religious discrimination. And I know that was a big part of the initiative 2081 with the Parents' Rights Initiative.
Absolutely.
Right. And unfortunately, they're talking about getting that now in the legislature with this, as we are coining it, the gutting of parents' rights bill. But that's beside the point. So I think that's really, that's a tough issue for you guys to, dance with and try to find the best sweet spot here. Yeah. Yeah.
And talking about 2081, the specific portion they're trying to remove has to do with mental health records. Okay, so why is that appropriate? Why would you not, especially with transgender youth? They've got extremely high rate of depression and suicidal ideation. In fact, I was looking at a study earlier in the day where 30% of them within the course of a year report that they've had suicidal ideation over the course of their youth. Almost 50, I can't remember if it's 50% of them have had that suicidal ideation or have suicide attempts. So it's a very high number. And why, especially when the costs or potential repercussions are so high, would you not involve parents? You want parents to be aware of this so that they can be alert to change in behavior that might be indications of a risk.
Right. Well, we've had Julie Barrett on, her example of her daughter all of a sudden being in a shelter and she can't get her out. And she found out after the fact that her child transitioned in public school, was never notified, here, and then ran away and ended up in a shelter. I mean, that's not a good situation. If parents were notified, that could have been prevented, right? And I really appreciate you talking about this, Alan, because these are the things that people want to understand. Really, what is the law? I think so many parents do not understand what the current law is, what the current law is demanding or requiring school districts to do, and what is, the actuality of how this is implemented, right? And so that is the situation you're talking about. So with this proposed, because you're still in the works, you would still allow for parent notification and not have this compelled speech component, correct? Am I understanding that right? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And if a teacher is comfortable doing that, that's fine. Or if a student is comfortable doing that, that's fine. We're not telling people that they can't choose to do that, but it shouldn't be compelled. And there's a lot of history and a lot of precedent that supports that concept.
Gotcha. So what about the other two?
I think that actually, what the Washington State Legislature should be looking at is the potential for that being thrown out in court. And I understand that this is something that the Democratic caucus within the legislature, they value this, but they have created these conditions, I think, that are right for us, for someone in Washington being the next court president that has large sections of Washington Administrative Code or regular the RCW struck down because it is compelled speech.
Well, and there's so much wrong with keeping information from parents. It just is. I mean, that is like your first line of defense for your kids, your first, layer of protection. And now I mean, there's, a kid could be getting groomed and they don't know. I mean, it's just it's really tough to grapple with. And again, this is one of the things I want people to understand. What is the law? And so real quick, because I know we've got these two other areas. So you guys delayed or just you didn't implement this policy to its full extent, or as OSPI wanted you to originally, and then they update. Correct? Am I following right?
So when it was originally adopted back in July of 2019, that was verbatim the WASDA model policy. And we've been working within the confines of it, and we've been effectively taking care of our students. We have transgender students, we've served them effectively. I have not heard complaints from them, and certainly there haven't been any filings that the district is not supporting transgender students. So we were not deviating from what was deemed to be an acceptable policy. It's just that they changed the policy. Some of it was changing the wording. They changed it from transgender policy to gender inclusive. Okay. Then there are a number of other changes, but they also increased the requirements for these 4 specific areas in many cases. Plus, some of them were already there and were already troublesome with regards to the federal law. And once we dug into it and saw that, we needed to try and find a solution that allowed us to be compliant within both camps.
Right. So what are the other 2 areas then of that were the big changes? Where are you guys at with this draft proposal of the policy?
The next major area is the sex segregated facilities. And that's a big one where basically the model policy is wanting us to allow people to use those facilities, bathrooms and locker rooms, solely based on affirmed or asserted gender identity. And mostly what we did is we changed it so we're trying to allow for accommodation. And that's really the key here is we're looking for solutions that accommodate all the students, to include those that are transgender or identify as something other than their gender, their sex at birth. But we also need students to, and specifically, everyone focus on females, and we are more protective of females. We need them to be able to have their own sex segregated facilities. They should be able to go to the bathroom and not worry that a male is going to walk in on them. Same thing with the locker room. And so the change that we made there was to require that before they are able to do so, it's first off, it's looked at on a case-by-case basis. It needs to be coordinated through administration. And then we expect the administration to take a look at their facilities available, the needs of their population, and figure out what is a balance that's going to support both that student, the transgender student who's asserting those rights under Washington state law, as well as the rest of the population and their rights under Title IX types of protections, because there is also a requirement under Title IX that there are comparable facilities available. So if we're taking away, especially if it's leaning one direction, maybe it's more males who are identifying as a female and want to access those bathrooms, we don't want our girls to not have comparable facilities, because there's this other population that now, because of conflicting rights that were created by the state of Washington, have claim to what had been a safe space for them.
Yeah, it's hard for me to understand how one rights of one person are put above on a pedestal over another rights of another person. And that's what I see happening with a lot of these transgender policies. I get wanting everybody to feel safe. But now if you're a male that thinks you're a female now and you want to change in the girls' locker room, but you're a male, okay, if that makes you feel better, but it makes all the other girls in the bathroom or the locker room feel unsafe. I mean, this is not something that our work environments impose on us. This is not something that our government, even the legislature, they're not forced into these types of policies. So why are we doing this to our schools, I guess? And I know this goes beyond, this goes into your thoughts, Alan. But it just, I mean, help me. This is just not common sense to me.
One of the things I think is most problematic with this whole ideology is that the empathy that people talk about, it only seems to run in one direction.
Yeah.
For example, it talks about in the model policy they want us to adopt that if someone is uncomfortable with the fact that there's a male and a female locker room, if one of those females says, hey, this is not right, okay, we're supposed to find a different space for them. They're the ones who have to be moved and inconvenienced. Well, that's not realistic. There may be a lot of girls who feel that way, and we just don't have enough space for that. So accommodation is a reasonable request, but it has gone beyond that and it's imposing a solution that's overriding the rights of the vast majority. Females are 51% of the population, and those who I don't know numbers on transgender, but the numbers that they throw out there are oftentimes based on intersex conditions, but the vast majority of transgender individuals are not also intersex. It's a separate thing. It's an identity thing, and it's not a biological issue that is in play.
Right. So yeah. So for instance, if you're in a girls' locker room, if I'm in a girls' locker room, if I go back just a few years when I was in high school, just a couple, it's quite a few now. And I actually graduated from Mead. So hey, we're talking about Mead here. And I was changing in a locker room. Now with this, I might be subject to a biological male being in there changing, and I might see something that I don't want to see. I mean, I don't want to see that as an adult, let alone our children. And
That's
so that's what,
yeah, that is exactly the situation, and that's our concern.
yeah.
And federal law says we're supposed to be providing comparable facilities. But if we aren't really doing that because we've created a new rights category that has access to the same facilities that a previously protected group does, in this case, women, it's an impossible and an untenable situation.
And so this is similar then to real quick before we move on from this one, you were talking about the overnight trips as well. So where did you all fall on that?
We said we removed the overnight trips from areas where we left the direction that, hey, when possible, don't divide based off of gender. But when they are overnight trips, that accommodations will be done based off of gender. I think it was based off of sex, because when you start mixing those terms, that you may not be talking the same thing.
So say that again, because I'm not sure I heard you right. So
sex segregated accommodations, if you're on an overnight trip, is what it comes down to.
And okay, so you're gonna divide people amongst their biological sex, unless there is some other accommodation that is requested.
So no, that on overnight trips, accommodations that are provided on a district trip, they will be sex segregated.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. I might not have said it right, but I think I got your understanding. Okay.
So,
and no accommodation.
If you are not that sex, you are not going to be room with someone who is a different sex.
Yeah, exactly.
We're still not going to force someone. And again, there are accommodations that can be reached on that, and we've been working through this.
And then the last section is the athletics. So, and I know WIAA, if people don't know about that, like tell them where you guys landed again this is a draft. This is a proposed, policy, right? And so you guys haven't made a decision yet, but tell us where you landed on this, and then also what's happening with WIAA.
Right. Because there's an ongoing discussion within WIA, what we chose to do is we didn't really address it here. We identified how the laws in Washington give us the authority to oversee that, and that typically that is delegated. And so the delegation, we described that there's a set of rules associated with that group or that entity, and we're going to comply with that, which is something that we recertify on an annual basis. Now, as you mentioned, there's 2 amendments currently to try and protect women's sports in 2 different fashions, but ultimately it looks to allow women to have a female-only competitions, both for reasons of safety as well as fair competition, because there's clear biological differences and capabilities that are across, at least across the spectrum, and that it's appropriate for us to do that, but we'll do that through the organization to whom we're already delegating it. Now, I will share some
Which is
information.
WIAA, right?
Sorry.
That's the organization. So you guys
Yeah.
are deferring, you know, what's going to happen with athletics with what the WIAA decides.
Correct. And there are two amendments that are under consideration. In fact, I think the voting window may have already opened for representatives. I forget the exact number, but it's complicated, more than we want to delve into right now. But what I do want to tell you is that those two amendments that are intended to protect women's sports, they have changed those to advisory votes, meaning that people can vote on it, but they're not going to be implemented. And this, Jennifer Kilman, one of the other board members, had sent this information to me earlier today about how they, at some point in the past several days, have made that change. And I'm sure it was based on guidance from their lawyers that, hey, there's conflict with state law, never mind the federal portion, and that people can vote on it, but it's not necessarily going to lead to action. I don't like that necessarily. I do think that may actually allow some of the members in some of these districts that are directing them to go, well, okay, we wanted to say yes, but maybe we felt like we couldn't because we were going to get sued. But we were a yes. Now we will be a yes again. And at least it's still going to be a vote. There had been an attempt to just to remove it, table it, and not even have it considered. Thankfully, the WIA member said, no, this is going to go in front of the General Assembly, and we are going to at least consider it and see what our districts say.
Interesting. So, yeah, you just kind of laid out some pros and cons of an advisory vote right there. So more people might feel that they can be honest and transparent with their vote is without fear of repercussions from the state. But there's no binding, vote with this if it's an advisory vote. And so there would not be any change of the current law, which is biological boys can play in girls sports, correct?
Yeah, for the handbook for everyone who is in the WIA, which is essentially every school in Washington.
Yeah. Interesting. So how did the Trump administration play into this? You all made an appeal, and I might not be calling it right, a few weeks ago, and this created, quite a stir, a lot of public media attention when you reached out to the Trump administration after President Trump had signed the executive order. So tell me about what happened there and what kind of guidance or help or, feedback you've gotten from them on this issue.
So yes, because we saw that there were issues at the federal level and issues between state and federal law, we can't settle that, and we can't afford to be paying for Supreme Court cases or cases that are going to end up at the Supreme Court likely in order to be decided. That's not where we should be spending our educational dollars, on lawyers rather than on students. So in order to try and cut through that, we did draft letters that went both to the Department of Education as well as the Department of Justice, highlighting some of those concerns and asking for their guidance and highlighting some of the concerns that we have on the loss of funding, both on the federal side as well as the state side, if we were to not comply fully with either. And you can't fully comply with both.
Right.
So that's that was our action, was to reach out. I don't know that I haven't heard a specific I haven't heard of any specific response from them, and so I can't really say what the status of that is. I know that you see things in the news where they recently just filed a suit or filed a complaint against the Portland School District, and I know that other states have. There's things going on in California as well, so I don't really know where that stands. But as part of that, I believe a Office of Civil Rights complaint was also filed. I can't say that with absolute certainty, but I'm pretty certain that's true. And I know that's one of the required to work through a process and then eventually report back.
Okay. And which is, I think, very smart, savvy, wise, to be proactive about, hey, here's this, we've got this issue with complying with federal law when we've got the state telling us something different. So, and you guys are not the only district that's done this. Kennewick just did it. Do you know of others, Alan?
I know I've been in contact with other school districts, and others have been doing similar actions in terms of pushing back against 3211, looking at Office of Civil Rights. Unfortunately, one of them, Tumwater, that's where there was the female basketball player who was not willing to play against a biological player male on the other team, and they had an Office of Civil Rights suit filed against the district based on how that turned out for them. Unfortunately, I don't know of others that have, as a district, have filed OCR complaints, but I think that is something that is others are looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Anything else on these? I mean, I know we've really dived deep into the weeds on this, but it's such an important policies. And I know this is being, contested and really discussed in great depth. Uh, y'all are wrestling with this. So I really appreciate you going into this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. So what other things are, before we end today, I'd like you to just give us some clarity on, I think there's some things that people are still trying to figure out what really is the law. So as far as we've talked about the information on 3211 and a child's preferred pronouns, your proposal basically would allow parents to have that information to get notified. But others districts, that's going to depend on what they decide, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about some of this other information about seeking medical, having services after their age of 13? What is the law, Alan? That's a lot of questions we get.
It's complicated.
Well, and maybe try to keep it, high level for us. We don't have to get into the weeds in this. I know we've dived deep in this other stuff right now.
Yeah, and actually, it's a little bit out of my area of expertise. I'm not in the medical field, although someone had written me and we were discussing specifically what children are able to do and not able to do with and without parental consent, and specifically with regards to gender related medical treatments. And you go to the state sites, and although it's not clear, it basically lays out that it goes, well, you may be able to get care without having consent from your parents. And more than anything, it seems like to lean towards, yeah, you probably can. I can't guarantee you it. It may depend on what specific provider you go to. It may depend on some specific situations. But one of the options that is written into Washington state law is something called the mature minor, and where a provider can speak with them. And again, don't quote me on this. This is outside my area expertise, but my understanding of this is that if that gives some authority delegated to the provider, that if they think they're dealing with someone who is mature enough to be able to make their own decisions, then they can consider them essentially an emancipated minor with regards to being able to make medical decisions. So things like hormones and similar treatments are available, and you don't have to ask.
Wow.
Get parental permission, and that's crazy.
And that's happening in schools. That's what I'm getting at, and why I'm asking you. What is happening in schools? Are teachers and staff able to make that determination?
No, that is not. That's state law with regards to medical providers. Now, I will tell you that there is a school clinic at one of our schools over at Shiloh Hills, and that was actually something we looked at very, very carefully. And we had them in and had them talking about it, and we had concerns about, are they taking actions that would be politically controversial? For example, are they doing things like gender affirming care, things like abortion referrals? And they went over their policies, and ultimately there was a level of comfort based on their policies that, hey, we don't do these specific items, that we were comfortable continuing on with that service. it is serving a low income area, and some of those families do really depend on that. Also, there's a shortage of mental health treatment, and that's a lot of what they do offer. So it was an area of concern. It's something that we looked at specifically for those reasons.
Okay. So it's and the other question I have on that is oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. There's so much with that. Can a child get any kind of access to drug treatment or vaccinations, a student that is 13 years and older?
That is beyond my level of knowledge. I know that there are a few instances where we may be providing like a date where parents can bring their children to get vaccines. But again, that's specifically the parents already bring them. It's not during
Right.
school hours. I I don't believe that that's going on at all within our school and is not being offered by our staff. And it's not something that would certainly be a regular capability. We don't keep vaccines on hand. We're not keeping much in the way of medications. And we are pretty stringent in terms of making sure there's parental notification whenever there is medical treatment. I know that I see that with my kids. We're all get a notice if my kid goes in and sees one of the nurses.
Yeah, but on some like routinely things, not, some of these other more controversial topics, right?
Correct.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that's where parents, there's just been so much back and forth on this and trying to understand what is the law, how does this, you know, play out in our kids' school? What are the parents going to be notified about? And it's interesting because you said mental health at this clinic, right? That is
Mhm.
provided. So do all parents have access to those mental health notes or information if a child gets services there, no
Well,
matter age?
they're subject to Washington state law, and so that's a bit of a mixed bag. And we talked to them about that specifically, and that was one of our concerns. So there are cases where a child can be seen for medical needs. I don't recall all of the details on the behavioral health side, but that was less opened up than, for example, the medical. But there's the laws in the state of Washington, and
Yeah,
you talk about people want to know what the laws say. Well, it depends which laws, because there's the federal and there's the state, and there's also conflict even within each of those two categories. So it's not black and white.
yeah. Wow. It is definitely quite a time to be a school board director. And, I think what you're all are doing and listening to the parents and continue to listen and give them the opportunity to provide feedback is key. Is there other hot issues besides these that are really, pressing for parents out there right now, Alan, with the school board district?
I don't know that I would say there's another one that's a really a specific hot topic. I do know that, for example, when we talked earlier about teachers who are asking pronouns, that's a hot topic, and that was something that we addressed early on in the year, and then we'll be watching it because not necessarily everybody got the memo. So that's one of those areas where parents are understandably unhappy about those situations. And based on what federal and state law, we expect that teachers are not doing that. So we're trying to build that within the culture of our staff. And the other thing that I think probably is worth talking about is what this is we haven't talked about. We've talked about a cultural issue this entire time, and honestly, the problem is in our school districts are not cultural issues. The problems are educational achievement, and that there's
Right.
been problems with the educational performance of schools across the country for decades, and even more so since COVID. And we are not fixing that.
Uh-uh.
This is where we should be. This is the question I think that the news should be asked. Is not like, all right, well, why are you taking on this policy? We're not doing it by choice. We are doing this only because the state made this an issue. I would much rather prefer to be working on curriculum issues, trying to figure out smart ways to bring AI into the classroom. It's a great tool. It's something we need our kids to learn, and it can help us be more effective in terms of educating them. But getting those kids who have educational loss based on what was done to them during COVID, that needs to be a high priority. And yeah, just focusing on the basics of education. And that's really the conversation, unfortunately, we should have been having, but we can't.
Well, and it is, I think that brings a great point, because now you have the state, like you said, it's basically the Department of Education. We call it Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, that is mandating you against this policy, right? And threatening. We didn't talk about what they were threatening, if they were threatening funding, or what the consequence of you not complying was.
We
That
understood what that is, but I mean,
okay?
they've got the ability. I mean, by law, it does talk about how they can withhold funding.
Yeah. So yeah.
Although let's point out that the Constitution of Washington also says it is the state's paramount duty to adequately
Right. I
provide
think there could be a lot of discussion around whether or not that's an appropriate constitutional reality that the superintendent of public instruction could do, is withhold funding. Anyway, but that is, I mean, they're threatening, they're sending these letters and saying you have to comply, and making you focus on this issue, like you said, not on education attainment. And yet our education attainment in our schools, like you said, is dismal, and it's not getting better. So it is very interesting that this is what's being chosen to be focused on in our state. Yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah, it is unfortunate for sure. Alan, any final thoughts that you have for people that are listening, parents out there, maybe potential people that want to get involved with the school board?
It really comes down to we've got to stand up for our own kids, and everyone's going to play a different role. I mentioned how, hey, if you have never thought about running for the school board, maybe you should consider it. But you don't have to do something like that. But you do need to be involved, and you do need to educate yourself, and that's probably the biggest thing, because there are a lot of problems out there, and there's been a lot of guidance that has been issued based on ideas that are not aligned with protecting the rights of parents, improving the lives of our kids, and the educational outcome. And if we don't work together to make it clear that, hey, this 80-20 issue, we actually want you to act on it per the 80, or at least back off, so it's an accommodation rather than imposition type of situation, then they're not going to. I mean, you look at what's going on in Olympia in this current legislative session. One of the craziest bills, I think, is what is that?
Is it education bill?
It's not specifically an education bill. I think it's Senate Bill 5601. Has to do with they're looking to add some additional holidays, a couple of Muslim holidays to the state, the list of state sanctioned holidays. I think that's interesting, because I'm not aware of any Jewish holidays that are on that calendar, and there's only one Christian holiday that is, officially a recognized holiday. We don't even recognize Easter anymore, and that's kind of a big deal if you're a Catholic. It's great that Jesus was born, but really the reason he was born was for his death and resurrection. So, but that's not a holiday, and so we're looking at adding two, and we're in the middle of a budget deficit. So we're going to extend the school year. We're going to add costs for school by giving more paid holidays. This is the focus at Olympia just does not make sense.
No.
And if parents don't stand up and go,
what's that?
Change, if parents don't stand up and say, hey, listen, you either need a change or you need to be changed.
Yeah. Yeah. And we need parents to get involved and understand these crazy laws that are being pushed and promoted and passed through the legislature, because it is, and it's not common sense. And I think most people would be stunned. And so we have to continually work, I believe, through the party system, through people like you, and help, inform our parents and help engage our parents and our other citizens, that you have to vote. You have to, and you need to vote in some of these, non-presidential years, right? A lot of our school board, we have school board races this year. We have city council races this year across the state. And a lot of people usually don't vote in those because they don't know who to vote for, right? Yeah. It's not the R versus D, but you need to get involved and vote, because this is what's happening right now with our legislature. They are passing these very bad laws, very non-common sense laws. Like you said, I mean, I had no idea on that one. So yeah, Alan, really appreciate your time today. If people want to reach out to you, how can they get a hold of you?
So probably the easiest way is to, on the Mead School District website, you can, every single one of the school board directors, our emails are there, and that's a great means. I always read that stuff. I generally respond, and it's not always quickly. I've got other things that I'm doing, but I do get back to people.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for your advocacy and for taking it so seriously. I so appreciate, somebody like you. I mean, I know you're busy. I know you're retired, but you're also still working to take the time to do what's best for our children and to be in there advocating and listening to parents and taking it seriously and not just going along to get along. We cannot go along to get along anymore. And I think that was the shift that it sounds like you saw in your school board. Nice people, right? They're good people. But too many of our politicians, whether they're in school boards, city councils, or the legislature or Congress, just go along to get along and aren't taking these policy decisions serious. I see you guys doing that at Mead. I'm very impressed. And as a former school board member, I just really want to say thank you, Ellen, and to the rest of your school board as well.
Well, thank you for helping bring attention to this issue.
You bet. All right. Thanks, Alan. Thanks to everybody. Blessings and have a great rest of your day. We'll see y'all later.
Bye-bye.